Okay, so I am recording now. I like to let everybody just know and just to remind everybody that that's going on. Of course, you all have your cameras off, but you can always feel comfortable turning on your camera if you want, because when I'm recording, because I only share the share screen or speaker view. Like when I'm talking, I wouldn't share y'all's. Um, so. All right, so those of you at home that are just joining, I just went and, Simon, Gwyneth, and Zach and I just had a conversation about issues with the contour drawing number 2 homework. One of the things that came up in the discussion is really like the idea of ergonomics when you draw. Like, what does it look like to make a drawing that is longer? How do you set up for that? What are the benefits of drawing seated? What are the benefits of drawing standing up? The biggest thing that really comes up with learning drawing online is just recognizing that, of course, you all don't have a studio. Some students do. Some students have an easel. Some students have a drawing table, perhaps, that goes vertical. But a lot of students simply just have like the kit and a kitchen table. And when we get to your final exam, which is actually 3 foot by 4 foot as a drawing, part of the exam is problem solving. Like, how do you actually solve this problem? And it's really interesting the types of things that students come up with. And I like doing it that way because students have to find the solution to a huge problem. But throughout the quarter, the way that you draw will affect how a drawing might come out. So even something like, if I hold my pencil, like if this is my pencil, right, and there's my nib, you're actually going to get a totally different result in drawing from holding your pencil here than you are here. And a lot of times, when we're doing contour, we're holding here because we're kind of like really putting a lot of that pressure pinch, which is technically called your precision pinch. There's only a few animals on the planet that can do that, and we're one of them. And we end up really pinching down here close to the end. And a couple things happen from that. Our hand cramps up. The other thing, of course, too, is that especially with a softer pencil, the nib is going to get dull much quicker because you're putting so much pressure on the nib. So what happens, when the nib gets dull is that the line could change from this, right? And then slowly it thickens. I don't think I can actually thicken my line too much in this application, but then it thickens to something much larger. And the thing is that when we are drawing something with contour, it's all about precision and it's all about detail. And one of the things kind of to be conscious of is that the thickness of this line has a measurable element, and it is different from the thickness of this line. And so say you're drawing and you're holding your pencil down here towards the end, and that nib is getting more and more dull, then that line is expanding. And so that means that any edge you're drawing with that line is now expanded. And so one of the hardest things to achieve in contour is proportional accuracy. And this is one of the reasons why it's hard, is because especially with the continuous line contour, you're asked to like not really pick up the tool. And so then the pencil that you're using naturally gets more and more dull. Well, on the next sort of group of drawings that you're going to do, you're going to be changing material quite a bit, and stopping and sharpening your pencil will be more natural to the process. But even with a continuous line contour, that's like a longer drawing. I don't expect you to draw for 2 hours without picking up your pencil. And so whenever you take a break, you can sharpen your pencil with a knife or sharpen it with a pencil sharpener. And one of the things to like sort of like consider too is that like, how does this affect the way you're creating measurement? So if you're doing a continuous line contour drawing, I have a little night light that's sitting on top of my speaker. And I'm drawing this little apparatus. As I'm drawing, I'm thinking about distance and length and width and height. And as I'm drawing, right, like I'm using, in this case, the trackpad and the distance I feel on the trackpad to assess this length versus this length. And so when I redrew, when you saw me, I'm making multiple lines because I'm drawing again and again. This is all about feeling distance. And so one of the things that's a benefit to continuous line contour is that by keeping your tool on the page, it's easier to keep track of the distances you feel. And so it really can help you to actually get accuracy. While you're drawing, you develop the ability to start to say, okay, so I made a line that was from here to here. Well, when I look at that little apparatus, that little nightlight, I know that this outside edge and this outside edge have to be beyond this point and this point. And so just like you're already probably doing, the development of the ability to visually measure location and distance is really important. And so the continuous line contour helps with that because like you're kind of keeping the tool on the page. Again, though, you run into this problem, which is this weird looking hot dog thing, where you were trying to draw this line and instead you drew this line. And it's, drawing, y'all, is very much like carpentry. And I'm dreadful at carpentry. But when you're trying to build, a frame, say, and it's supposed to be a square and it's 18 inches by 18 inches, someone like me, I will often end up with, a frame that's 17 3/4 by 17 3/4 because I'm not super good at building things. And it's not untypical for me to forget to subtract the thickness of the blade from my measurement. Right? So the blade is 1/8 of an inch and you forget to subtract the 1/8 of an inch and you make 2 cuts, that's going to be 1/4 of an inch that you have lost. And so I always buy extra wood. But drawing becomes like that in the sense of like the thickness of this line is so different from the thickness of this line. And so when you are drawing, if you notice that your lines are becoming really thick like this, I'd actually prefer for you to take a moment and sharpen your pencil to try to keep the accuracy. Now, if you don't want this to happen too quickly, then the trick is when you are gripping here to not push hard. If you have a hard time with that, which I always did when I first started learning to draw, then come back on the pencil and try holding the pencil here and see if that makes a difference. And it will make your line lighter, which sometimes can be frustrating for students. But however, always remember that a lighter line is easier to correct or draw over than a darker line. So the first thing when we're discussing like the ergonomics of making a drawing to really think about is like, how are you holding your tools? And are your tools sharp? Now, the second thing to kind of think about is this idea of like standing and sitting and like what your setup is like. And by that, what I really mean is like when you set up to draw, the more time you take to set up and give yourself like a good permanent place to draw, the more your drawings will come out well. And when we are making drawings, sorry, somehow I've lost my screen and all the screens I have here. when we're making drawings, it's so important to kind of remember that your standing point or sitting point affects your point of view, which affects the point of view of the object you draw. So say you're seated at a table. Right, so here's your table. Sorry, not long enough there. And then you lay your paper down on that table. The paper is a rectangle, but I've drawn a trapezoid. Because what's happened, of course, is that your paper has had that planar rotation we talked about last class. And as a result, it's no longer a rectangle because you're seeing down it, right? Like you're seeing it in perspective. And that means that if you're drawing here, your arm is coming up here. Apparently you're very small and your table's giant. As you draw down here, things might be in accurate proportion. But as you get up here, the way that you're seeing can affect how you draw it. So you're going to get distortion up here and less distortion down there, because this part here is further away from you. Okay. Now, if you've ever been to Disney World, you know, and you go and you walk down a street in Disney and you look up at the buildings, you know, you're here and you're looking up. Oh, look at Peter Pan up there. Put a hat on you. So I used to have annual passes to Disney World when I lived in Florida. And so I would kind of like go and look at all these things. What they do in Disney is that when you're looking at these buildings, the ones that they want to make them look really tall, they actually build them tapered. And so what that means is that like the building itself isn't square, it's actually tapered so that it looks a lot taller than it's supposed to look. It looks a lot taller than it is. And so what's happening is just like that distortion from looking up, right? And then they build the edges at angles so that it gives the illusion that they're rectangles or squares or whatever, and that they're really tall, but the reality is that they're not. They're actually not that high, but they have them, you know, smaller at the top so that they appear to be much taller. And what that is just like a really, you know, sort of thoughtful and considered way to play with this, you know, what's happening here with this distortion versus this, you know, this is on purpose, this is by accident. And so this happens when you also turn in like a photograph to me of your homework. So if you take a photograph of your homework and it's on the floor and you take a picture of your paper, it's going to look like that. You know, if you take your picture from here. And so say you're doing a perspective drawing for me, and this is supposed to be a street and it's supposed to all be on all correct perspective, and your verticals are supposed to be vertical and your horizontals horizontal. Well, a lot of that changes because the angle that you took the picture, this is no longer a rectangle, it's now a trapezoid. And so when you take pictures of your drawings, what you want to do is put them on the wall. Just put a couple pieces of tape doubled over behind the paper, tear the paper out of the pad, and then take your picture so that you're kind of in the middle of the piece of paper and parallel to it. So you're parallel, this is running through space this way, and you're running through space this way, parallel to it, so that this doesn't become distorted. So the distortion that occurs when you sit, is more and more extreme the larger the drawing. And so you might not see it on a very small drawing, like a 12 by 9-inch piece of paper, but 18 by 24, you're going to start to see it. And you can always tell because when you stand your drawing up, you'll see that what you thought was in proportion no longer is. So the question, which was, a little bit ago that came up, was basically about sitting and standing. How do you stand to draw if you don't have an easel? Well, the trick is this. You have in your kit a little piece of wood. It's bigger than your paper. And the reason that you have a piece of wood rather than a drawing board is because that piece of wood was like $3 or something. I can't remember, $7. And a drawing board is 25. So I'm trying to save you some money. So it has a smooth side and the rough side. Always make sure you use the smooth side to put your paper on. So put your paper on it. And then, if you put your paper at the top, you can put your clip there. But then you should always put tape on the corners because your paper is just going to move around a ton. The clip is super helpful when we go outside to do the emotional drawings of the landscape because it gets windy. So now I have my paper and it's taped to the board. Well, I don't have an easel. What do I do? Well, depending on who you are, I always took these boards when I was in school and then I just drilled them into the wall like that with 4 holes. And honestly, for me, that was better because if I didn't do that, I would use push pins. And in the end, I would have, at the end of a semester, and I would be moving, I'd have 35 holes in the wall rather than 4. So it's easier to fix 4 screw holes than it is 35 pinholes. But you can't all do that, right? Like not everyone can do that, but that's what I would do. Now, if you can't do that because you obviously like you can't, then what you can do is grab a chair. Boop. There's my chair. And then grab another chair to sit in. Okay, because even if you're seated, it's still better to draw with your board as vertical as possible. So then you can put your board here. Right, so there's your board. There's your chair. So then you would go into this other chair. Now, this doesn't solve the solution of getting tired being seated, but what it does solve is the solution of like the ergonomics of creating a situation where you could draw with your drawing upright, which will get you better proportions and more accurate sort of, pardon me, more accurate proportions. So then you would sit here. I'm just going to draw. That's you. And then there's your arm. And you always kind of draw better, in my opinion, when you can actually extend your arm, because it kind of gives you more ability to have full flexibility to draw. So you could do that. Now, the other option would be to do this, and then you could possibly like not sit in the chair, and you could, sit on your knees and draw. But then your knees are going to get tired. Okay, but these are all solutions. This is going to be a better solution ultimately than drawing on the table because again, you're going to get that distortion. Okay, you put a pillow here, under your knees. You want to try to keep your board within the space of your torso. So by that, I mean like you don't want it to be really high above you and you don't want it to be really low because again, you're going to get distortion. I always suggest that you take your paper out the pad and draw against the smooth, flat side of the drawing board, because the pad itself you can actually, like, if you draw too hard, you can actually indent through multiple sheets. But also the padding of the pad, like drawing on multiple sheets simultaneously, can actually limit your ability to get that like pristine line that you might be seeking, because it's so soft and you're pushing against something that's so soft. Any questions? Could it be also possible to prop up the board on the kit, maybe use an upside down chair? Absolutely, Gwyneth, you could totally do that. Totally do that. Anything that you can kind of like maneuver and create would be perfect. You know, I would suggest that you like maybe put down a towel or something on your kitchen table if you're going to do that, to try to like protect that surface of the kitchen table. Yeah, that would be a perfect solution. Yeah. So just some helpful tips there on working with the ergonomics of drawing. Now, one of the things that we're going to be doing for homework is you're going to be setting up a still life and working from the still life. And when you do that, one of the things that you want to do is to try to create a situation where that which you are drawing, here's my still life. Okay, so like when you draw, you want to try to keep this thing that you're drawing as close to eye level as you can. Because if your eye is too high and you're looking down, you're going to get a lot of perspective. And if you're too low and you're looking up, you're going to get a lot of perspective. In both cases, you're going to be dealing with 3-point perspective because you're going to be looking down or from below. So you want to try to get this as close to like sort of like your eye level as you can, so that it's pretty even when you draw, and that will help you to create an accurate drawing and help you to not run into any real super difficult issues of perspective. Okay. Is it always possible? No. Sure, of course not. But just try, if you spend 30 minutes setting up, you know, it could save you 2 hours of frustration. And you know, doing art, like that's kind of like what happens, you know, like is that you want to take that time to set up properly, so that once you are set up, you can just go, versus like, you know, jumping into something and then realizing that you didn't set up, and things are going to be much more difficult as a result of doing that. So just some things to think about. Okay. Any other questions before I close down the whiteboard from the group?
None from me.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, and I don't see anything from anybody else. So, okay. Thanks, Zach. All right. So let me pause the recording back on. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about first day is this idea of composition and space, and I picked out some different paintings for us to look at as a group to kind of like just kind of consider, you know, how does composition work? Now, in terms of your homework, you're going to be setting up a still life and drawing the still life with multiple materials. And setting up a still life takes some consideration of balance in terms of pictorial space and the distribution of forms through a space. So the first piece here I have for us to sort of examine is a piece by an artist who just sadly passed away. And he was 101, I think. And his name is Wayne Thiebaud. So Wayne, and then it's something close to that. I can look up while I'm talking here. And he is, sometimes considered to be a pop artist, but that would be completely wrong. He's actually part of a West Coast scene, and that kind of took place at the same time as pop art, but not necessarily related to pop art itself. I was very close. TIE. Now, there are elements that, so THIEBAUD. There are elements to someone like Thiebaud's work in terms of like the utilization of popular cultural objects, but the goal is a little bit different. Pop art itself was more about, I would say, the celebration of the object itself, like a Coke can or a can of soup, like there I'm thinking about Rauschenberg and Warhol. And someone like Thiebaud is more interested in light and color and the effects of light on color, even though he may be using popular cultural elements, in this case, pencils, lipstick, mirror, matches, etc. Now, I selected this piece because it's a very complicated composition. So, when we think about composition, and I'm really thinking here in terms of like Western art. When we're thinking about composition, we have this very long history of composition, in which, in terms of Western art, especially with painting, we can go all the way back to, classical art periods. In terms of painting, the Pompeian paintings in Pompeii are probably the highest examples of Western painting prior to the fall of the Roman Empire and the symbolic, simplified visual language of the medieval period. That was predominantly a result of the need of Christianity to connect with mass audiences. And I talk about that a little bit later in the quarter. But most compositions in Western art are built around sort of like these ideas of foreground, middle ground, background, and then the distribution of positive forms and negative forms, or positive space and negative space. And then also energy in terms of like whether an object is static or an object is like active. And so there are some rules that generally get spoken. Things that have angles, maybe a different color. Thiebaud uses a lot of blue, so it's not the best color to pick. So angles have energy. Angles have energy because they break through pictorial space. So what I mean by that is that they are part of pictorial space that is projecting inwards or outwards. And so therefore have like an energy to point towards us or point away from us, and to pull us in or push us out. So here, all these angles that are being utilized are all sort of part of the system of the control of the composition. Those are going to be balanced against pauses created by static objects. So the lipstick is a static object. This jar is a static object. Okay, even the sides of the matches are static. We're also confronted in a way, this is static, right, with these ovals that have been included that also give us a sense of pause. But they're also part of a rhythm, right? And so the rhythm here we could start to see, if we look at circles and ovals, we could build ourselves a rhythm through the space based on, these sort of like lily pads of surface that have been included. So, perhaps we could say, okay, like 1, 2, 3, 4, this oval here, 5, maybe this circle here, 6. So we're kind of like able to jump through the space based on the location of these ovals and the surfaces of the ovals. Then we've also, like I said, got these angles that are pushing us in and out of the space. Now, if we look to, the painter has also done something which is quite tricky and fun, which is created compositional elements within the mirrors that are also manipulating our eye within the space. So if each one of these lines has an arrow, then we can imagine that they are directing us through space in different directions. Now, most people in the West tend to enter compositional spaces through the left side and exit through the right. They know this because they have set up situations where they have like the ability to track people's pupils through paintings and drawings. And so they can kind of read the way that most people kind of like enter and exit a drawing or a painting. And if you think about this, this does correlate to the way that we tend to, the way that we read in the West is left to right. And so pictorial space then can be connected to, text in that sense. This is an extremely complicated and complex composition. It has lots of circles, it has lots of angles, there's space between the objects that we can get lost within. And everything has to be balanced in a way that feels comfortable, perhaps, or engaging. That's a better word than comfortable, engaging. So we might look at the distance between the top of this lipstick and the top of that jar and think it's arbitrary, but it's not. We can wonder, as people engaged in making art, how long did it take Thibaut to set up that distance? How long did it take to figure out this distance? Because it's not just that distance, right? Like the relationship of this form here to this form here is not just appearing there. It's also appearing here. And how much of that is appearing is related to the distance between here and here, the mirror. So if the mirror moved down, then we may not get any of this reflection in the mirror. And so the placement of the mirror is very specific to the placement of the forms, and the forms are very specific to the placement of one another. And so when you set up a composition, you need to think about things like this. This is one of Thiebaud's earlier paintings from the 60s of figures. Now, I put some figurative work in here on purpose so that we can kind of think about how the figure interacts with space, because I'm a figurative painter, figurative drawer, and so I think about this stuff a lot. But also the figure is something we can relate to. So let's look at this painting. Let's remove context, right? Like, let's not think about the possible objectification of this woman eating this ice cream. Let's remove that and let's just look at visual stimulation and visual language. We have a really nice sense here. What just happened? Oh, there we go. This is our foreground, the feet. The first thing we kind of see in the painting is feet. So the foreground are these feet. We then move back, maybe through here. And so this can become our middle ground, up to the hips. Probably, I may have overextended that, somewhere through here, perhaps. And so that's the distance from the foreground, like the feet, down the legs to the hips. That feels kind of middle groundy. And then her torso and her hand are in the background. Okay. As is all of this space. Now, something that Thiebaud's done here that's really interesting for us is the actual space itself is mostly white, right? Like, this is mostly white space. And as a result, it's kind of ambiguous at times. And that's why the utilization of the figure can be really helpful, you know, from the feet to the shins, foreground, from the shins to the hips, middle ground, from the hips to the top, like this vertical torso, background. So someone who's doing stuff like this now, which I find really interesting and really important in terms of her placement in contemporary art, is Jenna Gribben. Okay, so this is Thiebaud. Again, this is Wayne Thiebaud. Okay, so let's look at someone who's also playing with the human figure in this way. Let's look at Jenna Gribben. Okay, so there's her name here, Jenna Gribben. Okay, now Gribben is a contemporary artist. She's well known as a lesbian contemporary artist. And she paints many, many photographs of her girlfriend. And she works from photographic imagery. And so in terms of like pictorial space, she's playing around with the type of flattening of space that occurs through something like a cellular phone camera. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to like perspective. So here we have a really cool example, in my opinion, of foreground, this person's legs, right? And then middle ground, and then the torso and the head back here of her girlfriend, which is background, okay? And so if we label them foreground, middle ground, background, we can see the way in which we are intended to walk through the space of the painting. We are walking from the legs in the front to the leg in the middle into the torso in the background. Okay, now we could also include the sky in the background as well. But, you know, I'm thinking kind of like these positive forms here. here's another painting of her girlfriend. Now, her girlfriend is the musician Torres. If you've ever heard the musician Torres, that is Jenna Gribben's girlfriend. They're kind of like a power couple. Here we see a little bit less of a dynamic foreground, middle, and background example. You know, we could say that Torres here is in the foreground. That seems quite logical. The cart, perhaps the front of the cart, is in the foreground. And then we have middle ground, and then we have the painting in the background. Or you could say that this is all middle ground, and then only that in the very back is the background, depending on how you want to read the painting. One of the reasons that I picked this painting in particular, is to look at the way that relationships of form can affect our flow. You know, so thinking again about the Thibaut, where we were thinking about diagonals and statics, right? So Torres here, very static, very vertical. The cart, though, we can see is in perspective and has that backwards thrust. And then that backwards thrust brings us to the painting. And we can see that the head in the painting is very similar in height to the head of the model. And so then we have an ability to connect these two heads. And we also have a diagonal there pushing us back to the subject of the painting. Now, just because Torres is the subject of the painting does not mean that there are pictorial elements like that jar of medium there, or even the color red that are meant to pull us out of the painting. And so in this setup, we can see that there's not, you know, obviously there's not as much there as there is here, right? But there's still the way in which the artist is attempting to manipulate us around the space. And one of the things I want you to think about when you are creating your still life at home is, how do you create static pause versus energetic thrust? Okay. The last painting I have is this one, which is called "The Neighbors and I Watching Mackenzie Get Out of Her Wet Clothes." This painting has a very sort of, you know, obviously historic pictorial space in terms of the idea of the figure in the landscape having perspective. And it's a little bit more divided into like what we call like the rule of thirds, right? Where we have this idea that if we break a pictorial space into thirds, it's always kind of going to feel balanced. And this piece is broken into thirds, both horizontally and also vertically. I didn't quite nail that first line there. It should be a little bit further over here. And it creates a grid system in which the artist is able to, again, create pause and thrust throughout. And so like if we pick apart this painting, I feel like we have the opportunity here to see how an artist might manipulate the viewer through object placement and distribution of space. So the first thing I would say is that all of this sort of like garden space is pretty much just negative space. You know, there's not a lot of stuff happening. Yes, there's like this garden hose, and that's kind of like pushing us around a bit, and some globular sort of like different color changes. But for the most part, our subject is not this garden. We do have the sort of perspective of the path pushing us through the space. And if we see here, like with the window pane, that is also sort of like pushing us back towards some type of vanishing point. That sort of like thrusting is balanced by this thrusting here of the blue jeans. We can see too that the back is kind of also pushing us back this way. If we sort of think about the back hitting the head, the stomach is pushing us this way. Again, that's broken with the thrust of the leg, the thrust of the arm. And that's all balanced by that red watering can. And look how even this dark window pane on the side is creating pause, but also it's not actually vertical, right? And so it's also energetic. And as a result, especially with the building back here being sort of like bouncy, we're sort of getting a lot of bouncy movement through things which should be static and things which should be solid. And so that actually creates emphasis on the figure, because though these things should be more static and solid, the figure itself feels more static and solid than the buildings. So when you are creating a composition, you want to be thoughtful of how are you distributing elements throughout the pictorial space. And sometimes you actually see artists working on a composition. Sorry, I need to make a new layer. You know, they have a canvas and they're working on a composition, and say there's like an arm and not, you know, hand going this way. You actually see artists actually add like another canvas to like extend a composition, because they made a choice in the beginning and in the end they recognized that that choice didn't give them the ability to create the balance that they were seeking. I don't want you to do that in this class. What I want you to do is plan out carefully. And so we're going to be working on creating an awareness of how to plan a composition when we come back from the break. Because part of your homework assignment, you actually have two homework assignments. The first one is to create studies of your objects in your still life, and the second one is to create your still life. So we're going to talk about that when we come back from our quick little break here. If you're watching at home, then it will be like nothing ever happened. But for those of us here, we're going to take a quick break. So the whole goal of today's sort of discussion that I just had there about composition. And so just as a reminder, because I use a lot of artists in my discussions, because one of my goals is to always like contextualize contemporary drawing for everybody. And so I actually am building a new lecture that uses Jenna Gribben in it, but you know, just as a reminder of names there of what we just discussed, Jenna Gribben is the female artist I just showed you. Probably currently one of the most watched and important younger female artists, at least in the American art scene. You can follow her on Instagram. She's an incredible painter. And then the other artist that we discussed, rest his soul, is Wayne Thiebaud, who, like I said, just passed away at 101. He was either 100 or 101. And Thiebaud is really part of the Bay Area painters. And that's why he's not really a pop artist, is because his goals were so different as a member of the Bay Area painters than than pop artists in New York City, where that movement primarily had its holding. So those are the two artists that we discussed earlier today. So here we go. I should just clear that. There we go. All right, so the first part of your next assignment is about preparation for this larger assignment. So we're going to talk real quick about studies. And for today's class, to get your participation points, written notes, drawings, whatever you want to include will be completely fine. I know we haven't done much drawing together. So written notes would be completely acceptable for today's participation points. So when we're talking about studies, the purpose of studies in art is literally to study. Okay, and so when students and I have conversations about studies, the question often comes down to like about quantity, you know, because the nature of being a student is sort of this like cosmic crashing of wanting to learn, wanting to get information, wanting to get you know, education with the reality of life. And that sort of like, you know, smashing together of two different realities. And so the question often comes up with, which is like quantity, like how many studies do you need to do before you start a drawing? And the answer is really, I don't know. Once you understand that which you're going to create, I guess you can go ahead and start to create it, right? And so there's often questions with things like studies of like, what does that mean in terms of quantity? And for like the beginning of the quarter up to about right around the end of midterm time, like I'll like just straight up like tell you, like you need to do 2 pages worth of studies. But as we get towards the end, I simply expect you to understand how much studying you need to do before you begin a drawing. And so drawing itself like is academic in the sense of like, you know, the college level academic art class is not a class about like you just coming in and making the thing you want to make and leaving. Like it's about training, and it's about sort of the production of projects that show mastery or attempt mastery or growth towards mastery of techniques and processes, right? So creating studies is actually part of learning to draw. So a study is basically something that is preliminary. Probably spelled wrong because I'm a terrible speller. And it's about familiarization. Also probably spelled wrong because I'm a terrible speller. Okay. So when we are thinking about preliminary studies, when we're thinking about familiarizing ourselves with that which we are going to draw, we end up with this question of like, how much studying do we need to do? And of course, the answer is the more, the better, right? So the more, the better. Now in design, we might talk about thumbnails, and sometimes in my drawing assignments, I'll ask you to do thumbnails. And thumbnails thumbnails are a little bit different from studies. Okay, so studies are a bit more in depth, a bit more intense than thumbnails. Thumbnails are literally about quantity because it's about like how many ideas can you get out. And so when we do some thumbnails, I'll kind of cover the thumbnail idea with you then. So studying for a drawing, like what might that entail? Well, again, we're talking about familiarization, okay? So what I suggest is this, and again, you're probably just making written notes today for a little while here. So say you have an assignment and you need to use 3 objects. Well, if you use 3 objects in the assignment and you look at each object from 4 points of view, then you would create like, 12 studies, right? Because 3 times 4 equals 12, obviously. Now, why would you do that? Well, say I have, a bottle of hand sanitizer. Something we all have in our lives these days, right? A little portable bottle of hand sanitizer. Well, I have that point of view. Could be interesting. I have that point of view. Could be interesting. I have that point of view. That's pretty interesting, right? I like that point of view. So the idea is with the studies, definitely for this process, is that the first thing you want to do is examine multiple points of view before you start placing your objects into a still life. Because say this is the first art class you've ever taken, well, you might find by studying your object that this point of view is not something that you're ready for as a challenge, and that is completely okay. Okay, like every time you draw, you're challenging yourself. And what I want you to be aware of is like, what is the level of challenge you can currently approach and be successful with? This is a pretty difficult point of view. So maybe if you've never drawn before, that's not the point of view of the objects you want. Okay. So drawing is like a musical instrument. You have to learn the scales and the keys before you understand how to play Chopin. And so, when you look at this very complicated perspective drawing of a somewhat translucent or transparent object, there's a lot going on in there that probably would be really hard for a beginning drawing student. So studies familiarize ourselves with that which we're going to draw to help us to make sure that we A, want to draw that point of view, and B, are capable of drawing it at this moment. So if I have 3 objects, I would create 3 groups of drawings that would be like this to help me to familiarize myself with an object from multiple points of view. So 3 objects, 4 points of view, 12 drawings. Now, there's simply creating studies in a sketchbook. And then there's creating studies as pages. And that's kind of one of the things that I want to cover with you now, which is like, how do you actually create an interesting page of studies so that the studies themselves become a form of layered drawing? Okay, so let's go back to the idea of the hand sanitizer. So if I have a page, it's 18 by 24, and I have my hand sanitizer. And for this, you're going to do continuous line contour. You can speed up a little bit, okay, with the studies. but I don't want you to do a complete gesture. It's not much of a difference here, y'all. I just want you to continue to focus on contour and not think about gesture. So it's a sped up version, but it's not so fast that it's just a gesture. Now I'm drawing quickly because I like to draw quickly when I'm talking like this because it helps to keep everybody more attentive. So there's my first drawing of my hand sanitizer for my studies. Well, what if my second drawing went here? Now I'm doing the same thing. I'm paying lots and close attention to the object because I'm trying to familiarize myself so that I can draw it better later. But I'm also trying to think about the idea of making a page of studies that's kind of pretty. Okay, so there's my second point of view. Now, what if my third point of view came through here? Again, I'm really just trying to focus on the study, but I'm also, again, trying to create a page of pretty drawings. I don't mind that word. I like the word pretty. One term I don't like in my classes is I love. I really don't like that term. That term. I think it's like using the term interesting to describe something that you kind of already know isn't really interesting. You know, you're just saying interesting because you don't know what else to say. So there's my third point of view. And then my final point of view may be here. Again, I'm creating a page of studies that's interesting to look at. Shouldn't use that word after just saying that. A page of studies that's fun to look at, but which is familiarizing myself with the form I'm drawing. When we're doing this, an artist who I think is a great example of someone who did a really great job of this would, of course, be Leonardo da Vinci. If we look at his sketchbooks, where, of course, we can see the invention of tanks and aqualungs and helicopters. You know, I think that because of the way that paper was scarce, you know, it kind of like forced artists to be very conscious of how they were using paper. So here is a page of a Leonardo sketchbook. Leonardo is one of my favorite sort of bad boys of art because, you know, he just never finished anything.
I can't see the sketchbook
Yep.
page.
Just pulling it up now. The one I just pulled up was like a fake page. It wasn't real. So I just want to make sure that it's a real page. When you're looking for art online, y'all, be really conscious of the fact that so much on the internet is fake and not real. You know, we're kind of aware of that when we're thinking about like watching a TikTok, but we're not always aware of that when we're looking for something like art. So, you know, like when we look at, you know, Leonardo's pages, and this one, you can tell for sure, right, that this is someone's fake Leonardo page, but look how well they've kind of like copied Leonardo's approach here to creating a page of drawings, you know, and obviously it's fake because it's got a camera in it, you know, whatnot, but, you know, and this one is fake too, which is this dragonfly. So when you're looking for art online, my suggestion is to use, as you know, look for the websites that are going to have the most reputable elements. So sometimes I will only look at something that is like a museum. So vamc.ac.uk is the Victoria and Albert Museum, I believe. And so we can use them and know that it's going to be legit. So one of the reasons that Leonardo was, you know, so naughty was because he didn't finish anything, and they would actually write into his contract like, "You, Leonardo, would finish this," and he says, "Yes, I, Leonardo, will finish this." and then he would start something and walk away from it. As you can see, like in his sketchbook, you know, obviously he wrote in a mirror, blah, 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 blah. But like you can see how he's thinking about, I don't know, to me, he's making really pretty pages, you know. And there is an attention to utilizing the page. We have a relationship between text and drawing. But we also have like multiple drawings on one page that seem somewhat interconnected, like this page here. And so when you're creating your sheets of studies, I want you to kind of like think about how are you using the space. And let me actually show you, because I have, just give me 1 second. I actually have a really good example in your assignment from a student that just did a bang up job of creating some nice pages of studies. So, you know, is there just like a way to hit the quantity of this? Sure, you can do that, right? Like you can get your points for just hitting a quantity. But what I want you to do is I want you to try and create imagery, you know, that is exciting to look at. That these are pages of drawings from a student for their still life, and we can see how they utilize the space. There is a you know, we can see it's the same objects, right, over and over again, but they're studying them from different points of view, and they're looking at them from different sort of like closenesses, you know, different distances. And I don't know, I just think that these are really nice drawings of studies. Okay. And so when we're thinking about how we're creating sheets of studies, you know, I want us to be thinking about the way in which we are distributing those drawings across the pages. So for this first little bit of the assignment that you're going to do of the weekend, I sort of tell you here, you're going to complete a front and back of a mixed media page. So front and back of 24 by 18-inch mixed media paper with sketches, studies, and warm-up drawings, okay? It's all just graphite. I just say, fill the page means a large number of drawings, but there's not a specific number. Just remember that the better your studies, the better equipped you're going to be to do this final drawing, right? And so when you are seeking to create your page of studies, I want you to focus on filling the page. And I don't want you to fill the page just simply because I'm asking you to. By that, I mean like, there is the arbitrary filling of a page, you know, where you're not thinking and you're just doing. I want you to practice the action of filling a page as a means to start to focus on composition and the distribution of drawings throughout a space. Okay. So that is the idea, you know, is that we want to create as many studies as we can within your 18 by 24-inch page. But I want you to focus on, you know, say we're drawing a camera, just stealing from that fake Leonardo page I saw earlier with you. Let's say our still life has a camera in it, and like maybe headphones. Well, then what can you use pictorially to help us go through the space? Well, the thrust of the headphone, the thrust of the camera lens, and maybe that pulls us here to the circle of the headphone, which becomes again, another lens from a slightly different angle of the camera. Do you see? And so you're studying, you're exploring, and simultaneously you're creating a drawing itself that has, an exploration of space and an exploration of composition. Any questions about the study process? Okay. So the final bit of the class, and again today, please just upload notes from the discussions that we're having. Again, they may be writing notes or they may be drawing notes for those of you following at home. So your contour drawings number 3 is basically the preparation for your first large drawing. Now I've got some videos here and they should all have captions. I made sure that they were on YouTube, and I made sure that the caption option was selected. The first one here, I just basically go through and kind of give you a little bit of a showing of a composition that I set up, and how I utilize something like the measuring tape as a compositional tool to pull us through the space, and how I'm thinking about differences in texture and differences in form as a way to sort of like create, an interesting still life of objects. I also then have a quick little video that basically does what I just did for you. But again, you can watch this. It just covers the difference between gesture drawing and studying. And then you have, again, this really nice example of what your study pages could look like. As usual, it's 24 inches by 18 inches mixed media page. Front and back, though, please don't use 2 sheets. Please just use the front and the back. And you're just going to use your pencils, your graphite pencils. Now, in order to understand what you're doing, then you need to actually look at the assignment, which is the final assignment, which is the abundance of contour drawing. So the first PDF kind of just goes through and helps you to understand like what I'm looking for. Okay. And so we're going to be making a still life, and that still life is all about abundance. And so it needs to have a lot of objects in it in order to fulfill the term abundance, right? It can't just have 2 objects. And so you're going to be using 6 different materials to do contour drawings of a still life of abundance. So basically you're going to be have 6 objects in the still life as a minimum, and you're going to use 6 different materials. Types of things that you can use, micron pens or ballpoint pens. You can use your watercolor pencils, you can use your graphite pencils, you can also, it asks you to use some wet material like coffee or tea, okay? And those are going to be really hard to draw with, and that's part of the fun. What you're going to do while you draw is you're actually going to draw one object for, I believe it asks you, yes, at least 25 minutes. And then you're going to draw the next object. But when you draw that next object, what you're going to do first is draw on top of the previous drawing, so that the 2 things will be linked together because you're doing a material change. Okay. So because you're changing materials for the next object, you want to make sure the first object is linked to the next object. And to do that, you're going to draw on the drawing before with the new material. So for every object, you're going to switch materials. Okay. And as a result, you're going to end up with this drawing with multiple different types of materials on it. Now, there is, this PDF of examples, and I'm kind of bummed that it keeps freezing on me. But I start off your little examples here with a discussion about still life again. Look at this still life. This is a still life with an abundance. Okay, now still life like this in 1650 is about wealth. Whoever commissioned this, or whoever this artist was hoping to sell this to, this is a very expensive still life to set up, not just because of these like goblets with gold and things, but also just the quantity of food and the quantity of fabric. And so, when you're setting up your still life, I want you to think about the objects you're going to put in to try to make it exciting, but also try to do something that's going to contextualize the moment of time that you live in. Now, this is a long drawing, so you don't want to put anything in the still life that you need. If you put things in your still life that you need, like your cell phone, well, every time you grab your cell phone to check that notification about TikTok or Instagram or whatever it is, you're going to move it and you're never going to put it back in the same spot. And so your still life is going to get messed up. So I have literally had students try to tell me that they physically drew their car, and it's impossible. So like based on the drawing that they created. So the goal here is to set up a physical still life. You must not work from a photograph. It has to be from life. So if you put a dog in your drawing, there's a really good chance that the dog didn't sit still for that 6-hour drawing or however long it takes. So, when I want you to draw from life, I literally want you to draw from life. I do not want you to draw from a photograph on purpose. So set up a still life with things that you think are in abundance. Again, with contour, the more organic the forms, the easier it is to draw, because organic forms are easier to get right. Because even when they're wrong, we're kind of convinced they're right because they're organic, right? And then things with lots of details are easier to draw with contour because there's more stuff to latch onto. So this is a student drawing. We can see that they've got lots of different types of objects in here. And we can see that they're using some type of wet material over here. And then, like I did with the other drawing, I'm going to kind of describe to you what they did well and what they didn't do well. Okay. So this is a nice, strong composition. Okay, we have the overlapping of materials, which I'm asking for. I do believe I may have mentioned that they had left out. I don't see any wet material in here, which would be also something that's not going to meet the requirement. You must include at least one wet material. Here we have that wet material down here. It looks like it's coffee, could be tea. But what if you drew, what if you drew cherries and you used cherry juice to draw the cherries? That would be a nice conceptual, playful conceptual element. So you can definitely be inventive. I would personally say that when I would use the wet materials, I would kind of make sure that I did it in such a way that then I could draw a dry material on top for my little bit of overlap. I kind of suggest that you overlap for about 5 minutes, because you could use that dry material then to tighten up the wet material. Obviously, because you're using wet material, especially if you get inventive and use something like maple syrup, then you can't do this drawing all in one sitting, because you're going to have to let those wet materials dry. It's a nice sort of example here. And once you get to the wet material, you're going to notice, of course, that you can't get that really refined contour line. And I'm aware of that. And, I expect that. So again, some drawings also to kind of like see where some students needed to be a little bit more, have a bit more success in the work. So I think that this PowerPoint really should give you a good, strong understanding of like kind of what I'm expecting. Okay. So you will notice that you do have 2 upcoming assignments, right? You have Contour Drawings 3, which are the studies for your Abundance of Contour, and then you have your Abundance of Contour assignment. Questions?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah. Gwyneth, you good?
How many objects should the still life have in it?
At least 6, because you have to use at least 6 materials.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's the thing. One of the questions that usually comes up is like, well, what can I use from the kit? Well, use anything you want from the kit. You have charcoal. It's going to get messy. You have watercolor pencils. You have pencils. But at home, what else do you have? Do you have Sharpie markers? Do you have markers at home? I've even had students try things like eyeliner or lipstick. And so, what we want to kind of consider when you're creating a drawing like this is you want to kind of consider the balance between control and no control. So like, say you want to get really experimental and you want to try drawing with lipstick, right? Well, that might be really great on something like a towel because there's not a lot of detail versus like, you've challenged yourself with drawing your favorite, I don't know, like whatever, your favorite hand-thrown ceramic piece. And you love that piece because it's got so much detail. Well, I wouldn't attempt to draw that ceramic piece with lipstick. I would use the lipstick for a piece of cloth and use my pencil for the ceramic piece. Do you see? And then you've got to also be conscious of like what happens when you draw a dry material like Sharpie over lipstick. Are those things going to work together? So you might want to also, in addition to doing your studies, you might also want to, like on a piece of printer paper or something, do some experimentation and see what's going to work and what's not going to work. Just because you pick a material to work with doesn't mean it's going to work. Doesn't mean that's going to help your evaluation, right? So you want to kind of like experiment a little bit, maybe on a separate piece of paper to make sure that the materials that you do use do work. So you don't have to turn in something to me and write in a comment like, I picked this and it didn't work. Because I'm going to be looking at that place in the drawing and going, well, that place in the drawing isn't as successful as others. And so like your evaluation would reflect that. Just like any other academic class, right? Like just like any other class where you attempt to do something and it doesn't work out, like in a chemistry class. You're supposed to make something specific and instead you do something differently and it doesn't work. You don't get credit for when it doesn't work. So, usually students figure that out, because they want the drawing to look good and they're like, oh, I can't leave that. That tea I used was so light, you can't see it. I need to double brew the tea, or I need to add some coffee to that tea, or, getting creative in another way, like adding dirt to the tea or something like that. Okay. Lots of talking today. I recognize that, not a lot of drawing. But as we move forward, that's the instruction part of the studio classes. It gets like that. So next Monday, we will be moving away from contour and starting our beginning of perspective, which is probably the hardest thing that we do. And so again, I would recommend anyone that can actually attend the classes do so, because the perspective section is when students have a really hard time getting through that, because a lot of it is math. And math is the bane of many of our existences. Okay. All right. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Nice and easy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, reach out if you have any questions. Those of you watching at home, reach out if you have any questions. If you do need office hours, just email me for a time and we'll set you up. I have office hours before and after these class sessions. And so I hope that those of you coming to the sessions will continue to come, and I hope that more people will come, especially if you can, especially for the next section on perspective. It's going to get really hard. Okay, have a good weekend.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.